When you kill one, it is a tragedy. When you kill 10 million, it is a statistic.
Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and in this video I'm going to talk about Command & Conquer Remastered Collection. I'm beginning to suspect that we are indeed living in a simulation, as it seems that both EA and Microsoft have their shit more together than Blizzard these days. After a couple of fuck yous in a row to the core C&C fanbase, it seems that EA have finally realized what people want from them, an actual C&CR RTS game, and maybe for them not to develop it themselves. While Remastered Collection was published by EA, it was developed by Petroglyph Games, a company formed by former Westwood employees after Westwood was shut down in 2003. Petroglyph have since made a number of RTS and RTS-ish games, most notably Star Wars Empire at War and Grey Goo. Whether or not this is an impressive resume is a matter of opinion, I suppose, but ultimately this means former Westwood devs remastering Westwood games. Since Westwood proper no longer exists, this is probably the best we could have hoped for. If it wasn't already obvious, I think they've done a good job with C&C Remastered, and although I'm definitely going to talk about the games themselves, to be honest, I'm more interested in what the success of this collection might mean for the future of the franchise, and consequently the RTS genre as a whole. As much as I've been enjoying Remastered Collection, more than anything, playing it has made me realize how much I want Red Alert 2 Remastered, which although it hasn't been announced, I assume is coming sooner or later. In the interest of full disclosure, particularly if this is the first of my videos you've seen, I'm not strictly speaking the biggest C&C guy in the world. I've mentioned this a few times in the past, but I'm generally not a huge fan of RTS games with one resource economies. Although I try just about every RTS I can get my hands on, I'm an Age of Empires guy through and through, particularly AoE 2. The resource management and base building side of RTS are what drew me to the genre in the first place, so one resource games have never quite tickled me in the same way. That said, I've always liked Red Alert 2, I appreciate Zero Hour as a pure ownage fan, and I had a lot of fun with Battle for Middle-earth 2 and C&C 3 when they first came out. Anyway, if this is somehow the first you've heard of Command & Conquer Remastered Collection, it's a budget-priced compilation consisting of remastered versions of the first two C&C games, C&C 1, often referred to as Tiberian Dawn, and Red Alert 1. As long as you have realistic expectations, I think you're unlikely to be disappointed with what you get here, but it's worth pointing out that these are remasters and not remakes. If you're expecting as elaborate of an overhaul as last year's Resident Evil 2 remake, you're bound to feel ripped off. What you get with Remastered Collection is comparable to Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition or StarCraft Remastered. The graphics and music have been updated considerably, and they've added many modern quality of life improvements to the interface, but these are fundamentally the same 1995 and 1996 RTS games they've always been, for better or for worse. Mostly for better, though. I've been surprised by how much I've enjoyed playing them again. Well, mostly Red Alert if I'm being honest. Tiberian Dawn and Red Alert are pretty similar games, and I assume they were developed using the same engine. They certainly look almost as if one were a mod for the other. For my money, Red Alert is the all-around more polished game, and seemingly most would agree with me. Personally, I played through a few campaign missions for each faction and did a couple of online 1v1s in Tiberian Dawn, and then moved on to Red Alert. Unless you're a campaign-only player who for whatever reason prefers the Tiberian Dawn story, you too are likely to end up spending most of your time with Red Alert, even if you are more of a campaign player. To my tastes, although the antagonist Kane has his moments, Tiberian Dawn's story falls firmly in the hokey category, while Red Alert's is more endearingly kitschy. Red Alert takes place in the sort of alternative historical universe that might have been a bit tough to get past corporate HR these days if it were actually a new game. In the opening cinematic, Albert Einstein uses a time machine to go back and assassinate a young Hitler. The acting is not far above a telenovela, and the actors all seem to be Americans speaking in terrible fake accents, but I wouldn't have it any other way. If you pick the Soviet campaign, which you definitely should, you get your orders from Comrade Stalin himself. Although I haven't played the non-remastered versions of these games much in recent years, the live-action cutscenes don't appear to me to have changed much, if at all. They certainly don't look very 2020. I guess this is as good a time as any to mention that I have actually played these games a decent-ish amount before, at least in single-player. I was a bit too young for them when they first came out, but I played them in 2006 when C&C The First Decade came out. Although I briefly revisited Red Alert 1 and 2 last year for my video 3 classic RTS games I'd like to see remastered, aside from that, I haven't played either of the two games found in Remastered Collection terribly much in the past decade. Still, I have enough experience with them to appreciate how much they've been brought into the present. The new graphics look fantastic as far as I'm concerned, on par with Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition or even StarCraft Remastered, at least in comparison with their original graphics. When you load up the campaign, they actually have you press a button to manually enhance the graphics at the beginning of the first mission, and it's really cool to see the contrast in real time. They've done a great job of making sure the graphics do exactly what a remastered game's graphics ought to. That is, to look the way you remember them looking, rather than how they actually looked. If you've tried hooking up your old N64 or PlayStation 1 in the past few years, you'll know what I mean. Remastered Collection's graphics perfectly capture the essence of the originals, but sharpen them considerably. They don't look like 2020 games, but rather like old games with 2020 polish, and that's exactly how they should look. The always memorable C&C soundtrack has also been redone by original composer Frank Klepacki, and it sounds great. Beyond presentation, they've included a number of gameplay and feature updates to mostly bring the games up to 21st century standards. The campaigns now have a mission select screen where you can conveniently jump to any mission you've previously played, including the alternate branches you didn't select. If you don't know what I mean, often throughout the campaigns, you'll have to select from 2 or 3 possible locations to go next, and depending on which you pick, you get a slightly different version of the mission. If you get stuck on a mission and want to try one of the other branches instead, you can now do that quickly and easily using the mission select menu. If I recall correctly, in order to resume a campaign in the old versions of the games, you had to load a saved file. And if you wanted to choose a different branch for a mission, you basically had to have a save file from just before you beat the previous mission. Speaking of single-player saved games, the way they work is a bit weird in C&C Remastered Collection. Instead of being able to overwrite old saved games as you progress through a mission, every save file is unique, regardless of what you name the file. Seeing as these are 1995 and 1996 games, there are plenty of those old-fashioned mission objectives where you lose if a specific unit or building dies, so you might end up wanting to save your campaign missions somewhat often. Consequently, you might end up with a pretty massive save game folder if you go through all the campaigns. Anyway, they've also added modern multiplayer support, including a scenario editor. The game features a 1v1 matchmaking system, as well as a lobby browser where you can host games for up to 8 players like in most RTS games. There's also a replay viewer, although the way it works is a bit weird. You don't seem to have a folder for your own games, you have to search for replays by player name. This is nice if you want to watch the top players on the ladder, but it's a bit strange that you have to manually search for your own replays. The replay viewer itself is rather lacking in functionality too. Still, at least it's there. You can also observe live games, and even though the observer mode is similarly lacking in features, including even a basic production tab, it's nonetheless nice to have. As for the multiplayer itself, I've had fun playing it, but as I mentioned before, more than anything, it's just made me realize how much I want to play Red Alert 2 Remastered, assuming it's coming, which I do. Playing these games over Red Alert 2 feels a bit like playing Warcraft 1 instead of Warcraft 2, or Age of Empires 1 instead of Age of Empires 2. The blueprint is there, but it just hasn't been fully explored yet. Unfortunately, Red Alert Remastered doesn't seem to have a very interesting meta. From what I can tell by looking at replays of the top players on the ladder, everyone plays allies, and you basically just spam medium tanks and try to out-micro your opponent. There's a bit of build variation based on the map, but the end goal is seemingly always the same. Medium tanks are good versus vehicles, and they're fast and maneuverable enough to run over enemy infantry, so they're tough to counter. I'm curious to see if Petroglyph end up patching the game, and if its meta opens up as a result. But even beyond its current meta, unfortunately, despite the many improvements included in this package, there are still some issues with the AI, interface, and controls that might make playing multiplayer less enticing long-term. Unit pathfinding is, well, what you'd expect out of a 1995 or 96 game, and dragging boxes around units to select them also isn't quite as precise as it could be. They've added hotkeys for pretty much everything in the game, which is great, but there are still some crucial things missing, and the default hotkeys are downright awful. There's no attack move, and you can't control-click to select all units of one type like in Blizzard games. You have to double-click, and like with drag selecting, the hitboxes seem finicky. Plus, the infantry units are pretty small to begin with. There are 2 hotkeys that you're not allowed to change for some reason, one of which is control. Control-click is attack ground, so if you're used to Blizzard games, you may find yourself suffering from the occasional bit of friendly fire. Alt also can't be changed, and alt-clicking issues a move command. There's a bit of a problem with how the shift key works too. While you can, as always, use the shift key to add or remove units from your selection, you can't have it do everything you may be used to having it do in RTS games. The game doesn't allow you to have any overlap in your hotkeys, so you have to choose between 2 normal shift functions. The first is queuing up movement waypoints, which for some reason is allowed in Red Alert but not Tiberian Dawn. The second is the ability to queue up units in groups of 5 by holding shift and either pressing the unit hotkey or clicking on the sidebar. 99% of players are obviously going to want to choose the first option, but it's kind of annoying that you can't just use the shift key for both like in most games. Honestly, in general, the hotkeys are quite poorly designed, almost as if they were designed by people who don't actually use hotkeys themselves. By default, you issue waypoints using the Q key instead of shift, and W, E, R, and T are used to cycle through the sidebar's different tabs, which eliminates 5 very convenient hotkeys for units and buildings. X is, as always in C&C, used for scatter, and G is for guard, so many of the most accessible letter keys are already used up on the default setup. Consequently, many units and buildings have rather inconvenient hotkeys on the right-hand side of the keyboard like I, O, and P, which almost defeats the purpose of having hotkeys if you need to reposition your hand and glance at your keyboard to use them. Personally, I have production tabs rebound to the F keys to free up W, E, R, and T. By default, the F keys are used for camera hotkeys like in StarCraft, but since your harvesters don't really need to be managed much in C&C, I haven't really found them to be quite as necessary. You can already use the H key to center the camera on your construction yard if you want to go back to your base quickly, which is rather familiar to me as an AoE player, and if you're attacking, your units should probably be in a control group anyway, so I haven't found camera hotkeys to be terribly useful so far. But I do still have 2 of them bound to the tab and tilde keys just in case. The best use I've found for them is in the late game when you have a larger base with a number of production buildings that may not show up on the same screen as your construction yard when you press H. In that case, you can use the camera hotkeys to quickly center the camera on a production building and send your new units to the front. You're going to have to do something like this since there are no rally points, although you do get to choose which production building new units will spawn out of if you have more than one. Unlike in most RTS games, making more than one of the same production building just increases the production speed of those units, rather than adding a second unit queue. Anyway, these quibbles aside, the games in this collection are in most respects much more user-friendly than they were in the past. Most significantly, you can finally use the standard right-click to move RTS interface. You can also have units always show their health bars and other more modern RTS amenities. There's still no fog of war, but I guess adding that would be too fundamental of a redesign for a remaster like this, where the goal is to be authentic to the original games. I wouldn't have minded seeing it as an optional feature though. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about the games themselves. They've been a lot of fun to play, and I think they hold up quite well, all things considered, despite the aforementioned oversights with the interface. I think it's important for the future of the genre for as many of the classics as possible to be easy to access in their most polished forms. But as I mentioned at the outset of this video, to be honest, I'm more interested in the precedent this collection might set than I am in these 2 specific games. I can't wait to see what EA/Petroglyph have in store for the C&C franchise, as this game seems to have been a success and a big step in the right direction. In my most viewed video, Why I'm Starting to Feel More Optimistic About Age of Empires 4, I talked about the importance of there being competition between RTS developers. At the time, which was before the disaster that was the Warcraft 3 Reforged launch, I was talking about the possibility of Relic, with AoE 4 under their belt, becoming a proper, more or less even-footing competitor to Blizzard. A Burger King to Blizzard's McDonald's in terms of brand recognition, where in the past they'd been more like a Taco Bell or Dairy Queen, having cornered a specific area of the market with Dawn of War and Company of Heroes, but not being the same level of household name. Indeed, in that video I used EA as an example of the direction not to go in. I think that made sense at the time, but, well, holding Blizzard up as the ideal probably isn't the best idea right now. Honestly, EA couldn't have picked a better time to actually give C&C fans something they wanted, and I really hope it's only the beginning. But I suspect it is only the beginning. I think it's fairly safe to guess that we're at least going to get more remastered versions of previous C&C games. I assume we're at least going to get Tiberian Sun and Red Alert 2 remastered, but I hope they'll also do Zero Hour. I'd be really surprised if we don't see Red Alert 2 remastered unless EA hate money or something. What I'm wondering is whether or not they're going to bundle Tiberian Sun and Red Alert 2 together like they've done with this collection. Personally, as long as the quality is there, I don't really mind either way, although I do expect if they release Tiberian Sun on its own, I'll feel kind of the same way about it as I do about this collection. I'll be glad to have it, but for me it's basically just another appetizer for Red Alert 2. Seriously, despite not being the biggest one-resource RTS guy, I expect RA2 will become one of my long-term staple games that I play on and off indefinitely if the remaster is as good as this one. I'm also hoping that the buzz from this and these unannounced but probable future remasters will ultimately lead to a new C&C RTS. I'm not even picky about which C&C spin-off it ends up being, although Red Alert 4 would be my preference. I know they already started and then cancelled Generals 2 a number of years ago, but I'll just take this opportunity to point out that Dustin Browder, designer of both Zero Hour and StarCraft 2, is a free agent these days. To be fair though, it's probably for the best that Generals 2 was cancelled, as they tried to remove base building and rightly received very negative feedback. Anyway, the point is, I think it's actually reasonable for the first time in years to postulate that we might one day get another proper C&C RTS, and that it might even be good. Command & Conquer might actually be back. Personally, I haven't felt this enthusiastic about the franchise since the lead up to the release of C&C 3 in 2007. Nothing's been announced yet, of course, but the success of this collection is a reassuring step forward for the franchise, as well as the genre as a whole. This is, of course, assuming that this isn't the last we'll be seeing of C&C, but I don't think it is. Anyway, that's just about all for this video. Even if you don't particularly care about these 2 specific C&C games, or even the franchise entirely, if you want the RTS genre to thrive, the success of this collection is something worth celebrating. If you care about RTS, and you believe in voting with your dollar, pick it up, even if you're not a diehard C&C fan. I'm not either. But proper AAA RTS releases aren't so common these days, and we ought to send the message that maybe they should be. So thanks for watching, and remember to rate, subscribe, hit the bell, and all that. See you soon.